My name is Dylan. This is a presentation on the education system from the top down. I've been to 2 residential treatment centers, Andrews Thompson and Nyack, and both my parents are special ed teachers, as well as 5 years in the field as a neurodiversity activist, and I'm also trans, so pronouns she, her, they, them. Public policy. So I would like to start out by talking about public policy of education and then work my way down. The first thing is the IDEA, the Individual Child Education Act. There are two main components that people think of. The IEP, the Individual Education Plan, based on the IDEA, which came out of the IDEA, and the idea of least restrictive environment, which basically means that an individual should be in an environment that puts the least amount of restrictions on them in terms of their behavior and for their overall success. Next issue is Brown versus Board of Education. That is a Supreme Court decision which basically said separate but equal is not equal, and it acted as the integration decision during segregation to integrate blacks into the public school system and into the school system in general, particularly pertaining to public school, but people The next one is an Iep meeting. That is the considered to be the review meeting for the individual education plan. Typically, the parent is present. If the kid is over the age of 14, the kid could be present depending on how impaired the person is. And then somebody from the school district representative is there. The teacher, particularly the homeroom teacher, typically represents the school. Sometimes there's a school-based. Sometimes there's a school in. Sometimes there's also a principal there, not a common. Somebody from the district, and the idea is that to pinpoint for the next year what are the goals for the kid, what services are they going to need, because there's also a review of services within this as well. What do they hope to get to, and what supports do they need for the upcoming year. Also, there is a review of diagnoses at times. Now, it's important to know that, and this is true across the board, that if a person has been diagnosed more than once, only one disability could be recognized. Whatever the system, and usually that gets determined by whatever the system says is the most prevailing impairment. Of course, that's questionable in some respects, but that's the idea. Nickerson letter. When a kid is placed in a district placement, so either a residential treatment center, day treatment, or day treatment in a residential treatment center. So sometimes a school might have residences, but also some people might commute on a day-to-day basis. So it really depends. If a school district does not adhere to the IDEA, which is also based on the idea of everybody in the Constitution having the right to an education, and if the district doesn't want to pay, the family can go to court, or whoever the guardian of the kid is can go to court and say, my kid needs these services. The district is saying no. And the Nickerson letter is a court-mandated letter, which basically obligates the district to provide said services. Section 504. Section 504 is referred to as the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which talks about non-discrimination and structural barriers. So that's also something that exists as well. The ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this is particularly an issue when it comes to higher ed, but this is the basis of reasonable accommodations. So the idea of extra time and tests, things that will, in theory, create a level playing field between the disabled person and everyone else. Also, the Justice Center. Sometimes in district placements, group homes, day abs, things of that nature, there is wrongdoing. The Justice Center is a New York State agency that is tasked to investigate wrongdoing to the individual or on a staff. If a staff is considered to have done wrong in some way, shape, or form, led to an inappropriate situation, the Justice Center is there to investigate. Okay. The next one is the administration of education. So state, local, federal, and the way it works is the funding. The states handle education, but the federal government can create incentives to on preconditions to handle funding for education from the federal government working its way down. So then state funding, federal funding, mainly we think of education as a state issue, but the federal government plays a role as well. Funding. So funding is a huge issue. If somebody's going into a district placement, there's this battle of who's going to fund it, what are the logistics thereof, the programs within education, everything from after school to community integration. These are all funding issues. City/county. So the way it works is when a individual is at an IEP meeting, the funding is handled partly by the district and partly by the state. And the reason why city and county are different because within a county, depending on how big the county is, there could be more than one place, more than one district. Okay. The district is where is the considered to be where your district, so your school affairs for the area of which you live in, is handled on an administrative level. Zone school is basically your local school, whatever that is, whatever the demographic. It's just the nearest school to you and the school that's assigned to deal with your area. Principal slash assistant principal. A school, basically, the highest person is the principal. However, in some public schools, special education is handled by the assistant principal. So there are some situations where you may handle a assistant principal more, spend more time with them than you would with the principal. Social worker slash guidance counselor. These are the people tasked to deal with well-being. Also, they can be at the IEP meeting. And in a residential treatment center, they are the go-to person, creating an intermediary, and their goal is to support the child, advocate for the child within the system, and figure out and help them with psychiatric needs as well, and as well as providing a safe place for the child to express what they want to express. The psychiatrist slash school psychiatrist slash school the psychiatrist slash school psychologist is the person on top of, one step below the social worker slash guidance counselor, and this person is there to talk about medications that the kid may be on, talk about different psychiatric things that are going on, and so on and so forth. Head teacher, that's homeroom teacher. Now, depending on what the homeroom teacher, how the school is structured. So the department head is, say, for instance, in a departmental setup, you might have every subject handled by a different department, and then kids will go to different classes for that, typically in case of junior high school. So head teacher is basically the department head, so the person in charge of, say, the math department or the English department. And the homeroom teacher is the teacher typically that a student reports to in the morning. And when school's over, before they leave, either to go back to the residence or to go home or what have you. And the homeroom teacher is also the person who is considered to be the go-to person when that person is in class, that person has an IEP meeting. Typically, it's the homeroom teacher that goes. Okay. Related services. This is the speech pathologist, the physical therapist, occupational therapist. Open structure is where kids aren't watched As closely we think of a high school or junior high school where a kid can walk around and be by themselves, and they're expected to go from class to class. But also coming from a closed structure placement, it can be very overwhelming for someone who isn't used to having that level of freedom. That can cause logistical issues as well. Nurses. So then you have the school nurse. That person's job, um, in fact, uh, the kid is oftentimes taken to the nurse if a kid during the course of a school day has to receive medication, the nurse will handle that. School staff / TA. Now, the reason why these are two separate things is because TA is the teacher assistant, but depending on how the school works, for instance, at the residential places that I've been to, the TA would be based off of, whatever staff was around to help out. They would be in the role of TA. In public school, for instance, a TA is a more dedicated role, which has a more sophisticated title, but in some places, the TA is basically just whatever staff is around that's assigned to a particular classroom at a particular time. Next, parents. Parents have a lot of power, and I think sometimes this issue gets confused. A lot of parents don't know what their rights are, but parents have a lot of power. In the Iep meeting, parents have the right to request certain services and ask for school support to do certain things, and really, their job is to play a role in whatever best suits their child to advocate for the needs of their child. Next is the bottom of the barrel, in some cases, are students. Students have, if they're under the age of 21, they have, in the special education system, not as much rights or leeway because everything goes through the parents. Next issue is labor issues. Teachers union. Teachers union has a lot of power. Over the last couple of decades, we've seen a decline in union membership, with the exception of public sector unions, including the teachers union. So within that, you have the teachers who have what's called seniority, tenure, meaning that they've standard union policy is this idea of last in and first out. So people who were hired most recently, their job is not as secure as somebody who has been there for an extended period of time. Then you have the substitute teachers. These teachers are teachers that are, they basically come when they're called. They're put on a list at the district. They go in there and they become substitutes. Now, this is convenient for a lot of arts professionals who need to take on extra work, things on that nature where they work on a freelance basis, and they're oftentimes described as the people who are in charge of babysitting the kids for the day, keeping them occupied, making sure they don't cause trouble, while the teacher is out. The primary teacher, the full-time teacher, is not present at the time. Okay, next is related services professional. So within the teachers union, it also involves school staff and related service professionals. So there's occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech pathology, guidance counseling, social work. Those kinds of things are also covered under the teachers union, particularly only in a public school setting, but that's something as well. private schools don't tend to have unions. That's an issue as well. Full-time. Part-time is considered to be a part-time staff member at the school. So in a residential treatment center, for instance, your part-time is also called a per diem. These schools aren't unionized generally, but they would be making, like, they're paid by the hour, $11.50 an hour. And their job is to help and support whoever the staff, the head of the shift is. Full-time and sometimes part-time, people start out part-time and then they become full-time. I saw that all the time. Full-time, typically, is staff, say, in a residential treatment center, who are tasked with an official shift. So it could be from 3 to part-timers work from 3 to 9. Full-timers may work from 12 to full-timers may work from 1 to 10. Every so often there would be a late day. So, one staff is tasked to have the late night. So one will go to 11. The part-timers will leave at 9. The other full-time staff will leave at 10, and one person would be left over till 11 when the night staff comes. Also, overnight and morning. Now, the morning shift is from 7 to 3. Now, typically, these are people who were staff at the school. They had a TA position there, but they started out the morning helping getting kids ready for school at helping kids get ready for school at the residence. And then they would take the kids to school and then go to their respective classes with the teachers that they were respectively working with. The overnight shift is people who work from 11 to 7, sometimes 11 to 8, depending. And sometimes, in some capacities, there's typically 1 or 2. Some of them also just do the morning shift, and some of them do the morning shift as well, and some of them just do the night shift. It really depends. Rec therapists. Now, depending on the structure of school, there either can be one rec therapist for individual residents, or there could be rec therapists for a given school. 1 or 2 of them for a whole school, or you might have smaller ones. Their job is to handle activities and logistics for people, what activities they're going to do after school, help out a little bit, provide activities, schedule the trips, help out people to get into it in the community. Oftentimes they might help them get active, provide activities, and really provide the quality of life for the kids. Next issue is liability. Liability is an issue as well. In this business, one of the number one issues that people are concerned about is who's going to get sued when and who's going to lose their job and suffer for getting sued. So, liability is a huge issue. Will I be blamed if something happens? And a lot of the things that happen within the context of the school system are decided based upon that premise. Also, when it comes to part-time, there are people who start out as part-time. They're teachers, are trained teachers, but because they can't get a job, can't find a job as a teacher, they would take on a TA position. This happened in residential places that I've been to. And then what you would find is when the head teacher, the teacher who they're TAing, they're assisting, when that teacher leaves, they would in turn get promoted to being a teacher. So it's also used as a way into the field. Okay, now let's get into school choices. There are many different types of schools available. There are public schools, so basically, these are the schools, your zone schools, the schools who are handled by the city, county. Then you have the charter schools. The charter schools are typically schools based upon public-private partnership. So you would have a private corporation come in, run the school, and be renting out space from public school. People say, well, it creates a private opportunity for poor people. Poor kids have an opportunity to go to private school, but whereas it also weakens unions because they're not unionized and they're using public school resources that diminish from the school as well. That are therefore not there for the public school system, and they're also taking up space in public school buildings. Boarding schools. So these are schools where a kid would go and live at the school and then come home either on weekends or school breaks. Day schools, so we think of this as either religious schools. We also think of this as schools that are like residential places, but they don't have a residential component. So they provide a therapeutic setting for the kid to learn with people who are like them and their peers, but they don't have a residential component. District placements. District placements pertain to residential treatment centers and day treatment that are where an individual is sent because they weren't able to. It's been found that the district couldn't meet their needs, so they are sent out of district to a placement, either to a residential treatment center or to a day treatment or some variation thereof. Trade schools, so that's art schools. So you think of like BOCES or like LaGuardia High School. And these are schools dedicated to providing hands-on education in various fields, including the arts and the performing arts. Okay, classroom management. Early intervention just refers to the services that a person gets when they're particularly, say, under 5. Because the thinking is that early intervention is key to create for the best outcome for the child going forward. ABA is applied behavioral analysis. The idea of ABA, there's a lot of criticism on both sides, is to create a situation where you have this behavioral economy where behaviors are rewarded, children are complimented for the things that they do. Point systems, and ABA is used to think about what behaviors you want to change and what behaviors you want to affirm. Point systems can be handled various ways, but the idea is to track a kid's progress using points as a means of um, seeing your progress overall. Sometimes there would be a reward system attracted to it, sometimes not. Sometimes it's based upon what you lose. So, for instance, I've been in a point system where you can get grounded, and I've been in a point system where you can't. I've been in a point system where it's solely based upon you won't be able to get this monopoly money, so therefore you won't be able to get this reward, therefore you are in turn disciplined as well. So it's used as a point of discipline. Okay, restraint and seclusion. So typically when a kid's having a tantrum at the school I went to, we called it crisis. If a kid's going through this, the other kids in the class and the teacher would be evacuated from the classroom, and then two typically cisgender males would rush in and restrain the kid. Now, this is very controversial because they would say, well, okay, people have died in these restraints. I've seen people have accidents. I went to a school where people were being restrained on a day-to-day basis. Okay. Seclusion refers to the idea of, we think of it as protection going into a corner until they come down or until they know what they've done. That is considered to be wrong. Or we think about it in terms of a residential place where they might say, well, oh, okay, you're causing a lot of issues, so we're going to remove you from the population of the school, and then we're going to put you in this room as a means of letting you know, so that way you can calm down. Self-contained just refers to the idea of a student in a classroom where, as opposed to, they don't typically leave the classroom for very much. So the classroom is settled where, you can get the help you need. The idea is for a more individualized approach. So therefore, you can get the help you need, as well as creating a safe environment for you to learn. And typically, as opposed to leaving for various subjects, you would stay in one room. Departmental refers to the idea of every subject you go from classroom to classroom, either with a TA. So your homeroom teacher might be, in my case, my homeroom teacher was the English teacher, but the class would travel with the PA, the TA, to other subjects as well. Mainstreaming is something that's done in public school. It really refers to the idea of, if somebody excels in a certain subject, this is done in a public school setting, you can integrate them by putting them outside of special education for put them outside of special ed for one or more subjects based upon where they excel, and it's also used as a means of community integration. Resource room is if somebody is, for instance, in regular ed, but they're dyscalculic, but they are stable and doing well in various other subjects, they would say, well, go to resource room for math to provide more support. Also, sometimes students who schools don't know what to do with to provide more support might send them to resource room as well. Sanctuary. Sanctuary model is based off of the idea of handling trauma and really creating a safe space for kids who have been traumatized to open up about the things that happen and the help they need going forward to create a therapeutic environment for the child to work through their trauma, so on and so forth. Co-teaching is a situation where you have two teachers in a regular ed classroom, one special ed and one regular ed. The idea is for the special ed teacher to work with the disabled students and the regular teacher to work with the non-disabled students. Now, the reason why they do it is to promote community integration. Every school is different. What works in one place may not work in another, but that's another common approach that we see. Closed structure is the idea that a person is watched 24/7, typically right into resident treatment centers. They're with staff, and typically there's anywhere between 8 to 10 students up to 12 for a school situation. In residential could be anywhere from, if it's a high school setting, not unusual to have 16 people just staffed by 2 people, and then 3 to 5 people for one staff. And another idea of classroom management is universal design, is to create options that are understanding that people have different needs, creating, say, an assignment that says, well, you can draw a picture to answer this question, you can write something to answer this question, or maybe even, maybe do a presentation, whatever. And the idea is that each student would just pick the method of assignment that is literacy education pertaining to reading and writing. Reading groups is thought of to provide within a classroom. People develop at different rates, and really creating, dividing people based upon their skill level, particularly for reading. Places, one of the also ways to do it is to do it based upon an individual level. So there were various books in one classroom I was in, and the idea was if you misread 5 words, then you would have to go to the lower level, and doing it like that as well. Reading programs. So there's a lot of highly sophisticated, developed programs for the disabled, for people who are dyslexic, to teach them to read, and non-dyslexic as well. Teach reading, that's another approach, where a structured book that targets particular skills that deal with, that pertain to the kid's level, and helps them develop those skills. Remedials is basically the idea that somebody who's, say, in high school may not have learned what was necessary in first grade. So they may have like a first grade reading level, but they may be in high school. So remediation is to think about, well, how do we remediate the education so they gain the skills that they need, but they can also move on with the program. Now, one of the issues is high schools typically, they say, well, we have so much to cover. We don't have time to provide this remediation, hence it's considered to be supplemental, which leads to tutoring. Now, for people who are, say, in a high school class but have like a third grade reading level, it leads to a lot of internalized ableism because you see all these people who are around you who are excelling, doing well, reading everything, not having any problems reading, and you, as a dyslexic person, would feel bad that they're not developing and reading as well. Now, one of the issues is I understand everything, so in high school, I might have a third grade reading level, but I started but I love history, so I understand just about everything. Tutoring. One of the ways to remediate is tutoring. So, also outside of the school system, if somebody is typically, from what I can tell, reading is taught from ages 8 to 15, if that. And after that, when they're in high school, when they're in high school, they have reading. They might have to go to tutoring because the school doesn't provide that anymore. And then after high school, colleges don't provide it. So basically, you're on your own. Now, one of the issues with getting tutoring post high school for reading is most places only deal with children. So ethically, and because of issues of liability, they don't feel comfortable oftentimes taking in someone who's over the age of 18. And also, if you're trying to negotiate these things for yourself, if a dyslexic person wants to get help, they would be able to call a provider in the community, tutor, but the tutor may be like, well, oh, are you calling for your child or something? Because that can lead to internalized ableism. State standards. So part of this is an issue of state standards. So they say, well, oh, we provide you with reasonable accommodations. You can, maybe with extra time, read or scribe, you can pass all these tests. So the fact that you have a reading problem is irrelevant to us. However, in your day-to-day life, what are you going to do when, supports aren't there to read to you and you're having trouble? Reading comprehension. So after 15, typically, only reading comprehension is taught. Maybe you have a teacher reading a book to class and talking about how you understand it. Now, because of my dyslexia, I was always placed with people who may only understand. But I was, but I understood important that, so I was using advanced vocabulary, talking about advanced concepts, politics, things of that nature. But when I try to read something, words are being skipped. They still are. Things are, I don't know oftentimes what a word is, even though if it's said to me, I know exactly what it is. So things of that nature. Next issue, handwriting. Handwriting is also typically taught from a book, but after a person leaves high school, there is no support. For a long time, I said, I'm not going to write in school, partly internalized ableism, and in turn, I never got the remediation that I needed to handle my handwriting issues. There's also occupational therapy that people go to as well, and various, like there are reading programs, handwriting programs as well. Executive function. So once an individual reaches the tutoring stage of where basically the only option is tutoring, and they're older, the tutor typically gives work to do on a day-to-day basis. Now, if you're trying to negotiate the rigors of high school or college, and you have no community of people doing this, and you want to work on your reading skills, whatever, whatever the case may be. You may not be able to organize yourself on a day-to-day basis because, as opposed to doing, we think of school being 45 minutes to an hour a day on a particular subject. But when 45 minutes on a particular subject, once you get to tutoring, you may only be able to spend 2 hours a week. And if nobody's overseeing you on a day-to-day basis, you may never get around to or deal with the logistics of having to do do the assignments from the reading tutor. The school is probably not supporting you in it. Oftentimes, it's parents who are paying for it, or Medicaid if the kid's an adult. And so, or Medicaid in general, but in my case, it was private during high school. And so nobody's looking out for it. And also, the school might be like, well, to us, the kid doesn't have a reading problem. Civics education, I know firsthand as an activist. My father was a history teacher, that the importance of civic education and civic engagement and issues of that nature. First issue, advanced placement. You can, in a public school, sometimes you have to take a test. You can, in that case, you would be able to get into advanced placement for people who excel in history or math, things of that nature. In district placement, special ed schools, that doesn't always exist. Special interests. So, in my case, I happen to be a part of the autistic community. I identify as Asperger's. Part of that is a sense of focus for things that you're interested in, also commonly called special interest. If you're interested in a certain subject, in my case it was history and politics, music, in that case what you would do is you might do self-education. Now, for instance, I sat at home, regardless of what was happening during school hours. I sat at home for hours and watched YouTube videos on political theory. Did it for about 5 hours a night. That's all I talk about, write about, other than music, of course. And in so doing that, I found that I got much further by myself than I did with an organized education setup. Now, if you want to do that, it was considered to be, well, that's on you. You're making the choice to educate yourself that way. This interests you. There's nothing wrong with that. But that is on you. And if you think about it, like, for instance, in college, you have 12 weeks on something, and what if you read the whole book, by the second meeting? There are a lot of different ways to look at this. Assumed confidence. So, people sometimes would say, like, you're disabled, how do you understand this? So I started writing about Karl Marx when I was 17 years old. People would be like, oh, how can you understand that? Most people here don't. Well, I understand everything. I'm obsessed with history and politics. That's not an issue. But then they would be like, well, is this really appropriate for school? How do we help this person? And then sometimes administratively, the support would be like, well, the administrative support would be no. So I wanted to become an activist back in high school. I did what I could do. I researched grassroots movements, stayed up to date, and did anything I could do. However, if my school got me involved with student activism, high school activism in the community, even if we couldn't support it, that would have definitely made things go smoother, because I was very isolated and marginalized with things that I could understand and that I was interested in. Nobody else was interested in it. I'm interested in it, okay. But if that's the case, that's fine. But they'd be like, you can't talk about Karl Marx, you can't, we're not going to help you develop your political ideas. You're on your own. We're not going to help you. Now, one of the things that happens with that is the whole issue of I became very interested in radical politics, things of that nature. So without the right support, I didn't necessarily go about things socially when developing um, my political ideas, so on and so forth, the right way. Plateau. A person, so we think of, especially without advanced placement, AP classes, oftentimes people hit a plateau, people hit it at different rates, where the school is already set in their curriculum, what they teach, partly a state issue, things of that nature. They say, well, okay. They say that you, in turn, if, for instance, by the time I was 19, senior year of high school, I already knew all the history from the whole school, that all the history classes that were provided for me, so I was bored. Now, that's all well and good, but they say, like, when it comes to state standards, that you have to do it anyway. Even if you might already know, and they know you know, there's no way to handle it. Like, so what I did once is I said, well, okay, it was, I said to them, I said, well, okay, you are providing me this. So then they said, well, okay, well, you could just do a self-study. I'm like, well, I'm here to learn. I want to learn from someone, so I questioned that. But also when it came to the state standards, they say, well, by the time I was 17, I wanted to take a government class. They're like, you didn't take U.S. history, you can't do government. So I started researching government. I taught myself the curriculum, so I knew 95% of it when I walked into the door of my senior year. Another issue is representation. So for a lot of minorities, they say, well, why isn't our history represented? Why isn't our culture represented so the members of our community can learn about our culture? We see this in the queer community, the disabled community, the black community, so on and so forth. And then it's like, how do you teach it? What do you teach? And the issues go from there. Tolerance. So a lot of times I was called a radical in high school. People weren't necessarily most tolerant when I walked into my government class, because I knew 95% of the curriculum. I was very obnoxious to my peers, and I kept on. There would be like two parallel conversations going on at once. Me and my interest in political theory on one side, and then basic civics, branches of government, basic history of war and peace going on the other one that really bored me. And and I used to make snide comments, things of that nature, so on and so forth, because I was bored. Next issue, and this goes along with representation, is identity and pride. Pride is a huge issue, because on the issue of identity, we think of when somebody has representation, they can use that to say as a means of developing their own identity. So, for instance, if somebody learned about Harvey Milk in high school, who's a member of the queer community, can learn about Harvey Milk in high school, it might give them more confidence in their coming out process as however they identify. So the next thing is civic engagement. Now, as an activist, I know firsthand that there's a lot of people who don't know the basics of civic engagement, where people say, well, don't understand the importance of civic engagement, so a lot of things happen in politics that people disagree with. And then I say, well, okay, why weren't you there? For instance, when we think of stand your ground laws, police brutality issues, we say, well, why weren't you there when these issues were being passed? People are unaware, they don't necessarily register to vote. People are very civically disconnected. And then you have like stand your ground laws or the election of Donald Trump, things of that nature. Where were you to stop this? And people don't understand the rights that they have, and so forth. And the experiment of democracy, when it comes down to the experiment of democracy, is a collaborative process. Jewish education. Within Jewish education, there's Hebrew school. So this could be either an after-school program, or like I went on Sundays from 10 to 12. Depending, you would learn about holidays, maybe some Hebrew. Developing a Jewish cultural identity is really the point of it. A little bit of Jewish history, holidays, things of that nature. Jewish day schools. We think of schools that provide, for religious ones, they provide Jewish education in the morning. So studying Jewish texts, Jewish history, Jewish concepts, Hebrew, things of that nature, and then American stuff in the afternoon. That's how the Orthodox, modern Orthodox, things of that nature. But some of these day schools, depending on the denomination that runs it, might be a little different. Some places are pluralistic, where they might have, like, for morning services, which they hold on a day-to-day basis, you might be able to make a choice of what kind of service you want to go to be inclusive. Demographics. So when we think of the Jewish community, it's important to think about what neighborhood does said sect of Judaism live? Where do they not live? Where do they go to school? Where do they meet? So on and so forth. So, on the issue of demographics, for instance, a good example of this is all the non-Orthodox left New York City and moved out to the suburbs, and whoever's left is in the minority, and most of the people are Orthodox. This also pertains to schools, so on and so forth. So, we think of youth groups. So, for the conservative, it's USY, that's where I went. For the reform, it's NIFTY. And the idea is to provide youth engagement, identity affirmation, and quality of life to the young people in the community. Student groups. Now, student groups vary at colleges depending on the nature of what types of Jews make up that community, what school, things of that nature. Now, in public schools, you either have one of two things. In a community college, you have a Hillel club. That's not so unusual. Of just a club on campus, Jewish club, and then for a bigger school, maybe like a 4-year, there would be a Hillel for the community, people who anybody can basically walk in there because it's loosely connected to the college, not really. Especially if it's not on the campus. I've walked into Hillels, and I don't even go to school there. And the idea is the Jewish community pays for it to create opportunities for its young people. Public schools typically, as I said, paid for by the Jewish community. And in the city, for instance, the CUNY schools are mainly Orthodox. Private schools, which to my knowledge is one of the few non-Orthodox groups. We think of Columbia and NYU. They have conservative and reform as well as Orthodox. So, also, when we think of developmental and intellectual disabilities as it pertains to Jewish education, we see that a lot of people are so depending on the nature of the program, be like, I went on an Asperger's refugee trip, so the opportunity to go to Israel is there, but when you get back, there isn't very much. So some places at maybe say Jewish Community Center or something might have, maybe something now and again for a holiday. Also, depending on the impairment of the crowd, that can dictate the nature of it. So I, in turn, went to a program that had most of the people there were intellectually disabled. So their programs reflected that. But that's an issue as well. Also, in New York City, for instance, most of the developmental disability agencies are Orthodox out of the Jewish ones. And that is an issue as well, because if you're non-Orthodox, the assumption is that you'll just go anywhere where everyone else goes. However, just because you're not religious doesn't mean you're not ideological. Okay. Arts education. There's tracking. Is an issue. Art/music therapy. So the first issue is people see it, for the disabled at least, as a means of coping with emotions, working through things. That's why a lot of psych wards, they might offer art therapy, music therapy. Tracking is the idea of like, where do you fit in as an artist? Some people may have more of an art background than others, so the creation of different groups can really help with that. Non-artists. So, as a musician, I went to music class, and all they would do is they might do basic music theory, but by that time, at the time I was 16, I was already excelling in music theory privately, and they said to me, well, okay, and the only thing you can learn is a basic C scale in the course of a year. And there isn't much to move on to because most of the people aren't as advanced as you, which is fine, and that would be considered a plateau. Because basically the arts education setup is there's nothing else they can Teacher. Executive function. And in turn, you can hire a tutor, use teacher for people as well. Executive functioning is important as well because we think about what's called artistic discipline. A person may be very passionate about an instrument. There was a time when I didn't practice much, and the executive function of organizing yourself to practice on a day-to-day basis can be hard. Audition. For a lot of higher ed and performing arts schools, you have to audition and get in whatever artistic discipline that you do. Higher ed. So higher ed, typically we only think of being able to take classes in classical and jazz. Sometimes there are other classes, but typically degrees are based on classical and jazz, and then anything else is considered to be elective. Now, as a musician, I play rock and roll and folk music, blues, country. While I have an immense amount of respect for jazz and classical musicians, and although I believe that it's important to be a well-rounded musician, I've watched documentaries on jazz, classical, things of that nature, even though I'm not into it. I couldn't see myself spending 2 to 4 years on becoming a classical musician because I'm not into it. I'm not against classical music, but it seemed like a waste of time and money. Even though I understand that it's good for your technique and musicianship, and classical musicians can typically play everything. But, trade schools. So, also, when it comes to higher ed, if you didn't have like all this musical training, didn't start music training at 5, you might be a little behind. You might be sufficient in an instrument, but not be able to read music or something like that. So you might be behind on some areas, so that also is an area where you might need some help. Trade school, so we think of like music production, film school, things of that nature where they are there to teach you a particular job in the field, how to provide a particular function, things of that nature. And you get a certificate. Usually these programs are 6 months to a year, 2 years max, from what I've seen. And you get a certificate, and then it comes down to job readiness. Now, in the disabled community, and sometimes at BOCES, there could be some art-oriented program. I know people have done like video editing at like BOCES, disability-driven trade school. Job readiness. So, if somebody excels in music, say music, well practiced, has a musical skill, they would be like, well, I want to become a musician. So that's an issue as well. When we think of job readiness, we don't think of the media as viable for anyone because people say it's a pipe dream. But in reality, I would argue that it's more practical than a lot of fields. For various reasons, I find that it's more accessible to me than fields for the disabled. As a disabled person, I find that I enjoy working in the arts. Next issue, sex ed. Sex ed is really important, partly as a safety precaution and also for self-exploration. So a lot of our sex ed is heteronormative, meaning that we operate under the assumption that everyone is cisgender and heterosexual and heteroromantic and in a monogamous relationship. Um, so that's an issue as well. Everything that happens in sex ed typically focuses on relations between male and female, modesty. So, like in the history of the women's movement, there was this idea of not being seen as particularly for the disabled. We see, well, oh, you're not likely to be a sexual being just because you're disabled. So you have to sense of modesty, relationships, having a polished relationship, things of that nature. Assumed confidence, so they assume that you are deviant. Oftentimes in sex ed, that everyone's just out to get laid all the time, and that people are making risky decisions. Regardless of somebody's romantically or sexually active or not, that they always assume the worst. And so, next issue is it's very binary. So, male and female. And the way it works is it's based on what you were assigned at birth. It's uncomfortable. It can be very awkward because we live in a society that is very uncomfortable with teaching sexuality to kids. Oftentimes, kids, because there's a lot of myths surrounding the topic, feel very uncomfortable about it. Also, it could be an issue of trauma. You think of like a trauma being. Another issue when it comes to sex ed is trauma, because a lot of people who have a history of sexual abuse might have a strong level of discomfort when it comes to sex ed, tolerance. So a lot of people who are part of the queer community experience a level of intolerance when it comes to sex ed. That's an issue as well. Closed structure. In closed structure residential treatment centers, people are not allowed to engage in relationships, because in residential treatment center, the argument is if you're in residential treatment center, you're there to work on what you're there to work on, and because of that, you're not allowed to be in relationships. I've seen staff sit in between couples and try to break them up. Open structure. An issue of relationships in an open structure, while they are allowed, once it becomes a public relationship on public display on the campus, the parents have to be notified, so the child gets outed to whoever the guardian is. Another issue in sex ed is queer education. A lot of people aren't taught in sex ed the idea of the gender spectrum that exists from people who are cisgender, identified as the gender of which they were assigned at birth, the sexes which they were assigned to trans, and non-binary, and everything in the middle. A lot of people aren't taught that. That can lead to a lot of confusion. Gender expression. A lot of people, as someone who has Asperger's, I was never taught about the idea of gender expression and how, like, for instance, having a beard made me identify masculine when I don't identify that way. Also, a lot of intersex people are left out of sex ed. So a lot of people who are biologically a mixture of male and female. Split attraction. Split attraction is the idea that someone's attraction is different depending on what there are different types of attraction. So that's platonic, aesthetic, romantic, and sexual. Gender, sexuality, and romantic spectrum. There's so many different ways to interact with sexuality and romance. Not everything is attractive to everyone. So, for instance, some people are asexual, and some people are can be anywhere from asexual, not experiencing sexual attraction, to allosexual, experiencing sexual attraction, to different orientations of who they're attracted to. Some people are asexual, like me. I'm also biromantic, whereas some people are experience aesthetic attraction for males and females, but may only be heteromantic. They may only date men, and so on and so on. Gay sex methods. This is also applicable to trans and intersex as well. For instance, you are not taught in sex ed how gay sex works. So there are a lot of people who experience who, for instance, they don't tell you that if you're engaging in anal sex without lube, that can induce physical pain. That's an issue as well. So issues of that nature are not taught. Kink. There are different ways to interact with sexuality. There are certain things that aren't taught when it comes to kink, such as that some people don't know the importance of a safe word and how everything is consensual. So that is an issue. Safe word and people understanding what the different options are and how to stay safe in a BDSM context. Relationship styles. Not every relationship style would be applicable to everyone. So there's different types of relationships. Conventional wisdom says monogamous, polyamorous, open, platonic. There's a lot of different types of relationships to have with people. Support system. Without this support system, people need the support system to develop their identities as well, to deal with identity and pride, because we live in a society that is not necessarily the most open to our identities, so we need support to help learn to accept ourselves. And also because a lot of us may be confused about our identity, so on and so forth. Also erasure. Erasure is an issue as well, because we feel like our identities are inadequate because they don't fit into and they're absent from the conventional wisdom context of the society. So we feel a sense of erasure because it is telling us that our type of relationship is not good enough, our orientation, identity, so on, so forth, is not considered good enough. Queer healthcare. It's important to learn how to stay safe. So, it's not talked about in schools. How to get PrEP, and how to get hormone replacement therapy. So that's an issue as well.